when half of England was ruled by Vikings. Imagine it, the line of a treaty carved not into stone, but into the living heart of a kingdom. To the south and west, Anglo-Saxon law. To the north and east, Viking law. Two worlds, one island. How did England survive this fracture, and what traces remain of it today? By the mid-9th century, England wasn't yet England. It was a patchwork of kingdoms: Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, East Anglia. Then came the Great Heathen Army in 865. Not just raiders, but settlers. Long ships brought warriors, families, even entire communities who intended to stay. Here enters our composite character Edgar, a Mercian farmer's son living near the border of what would become the Danelaw. He grew up in a world where the horizon was never safe. Smoke from a nearby village meant not just firewood, but raiding. To him, the Vikings weren't faceless invaders. They were neighbours, traders, sometimes even kin by marriage. Yet the violence was undeniable. Kingdom after kingdom fell. In 869, the last king of East Anglia, Edmund, was killed, later revered as a saint. For people like Edgar, life was a daily calculation: pay tribute, flee, or fight. But who would rise to push back against the Viking tide? The answer lay in the most unlikely of survivors, Alfred of Wessex. Beset by illness, driven into hiding, Alfred famously retreated into the marshes of Athelney. Our Edgar would have heard rumours: a king reduced to a fugitive, said to have burned the cakes of a peasant woman while plotting his return. To ordinary folk, Alfred's resilience mattered. If a king could recover from such humiliation, perhaps the land itself could survive. By 878, Alfred struck back. At Edington, he forced the Viking leader, Guthrum, to the negotiating table. But this wasn't a final victory, it was a compromise. England wasn't won, it was divided. So what did that division look like? The Treaty of Alfred and Guthrum drew a line across the land. Roughly, it ran from London up through Bedfordshire and along the old Roman road of Watling Street. To the west and south, Anglo-Saxon law. To the north and east, the Danelaw. For Edgar, this was more than a border on parchment. It cut through trade routes, family ties, and even language. Imagine crossing from one side to the other. The words for everyday life would change. The customs of inheritance would differ. Even the weight of a coin might feel unfamiliar in your hand. It wasn't a wall, it was a frontier of culture. But what exactly did Danelaw mean in practice? The term itself, Danelaw, meant simply that Danish law applied. For everyday people, that meant new rules about landholding, compensation and punishment. The Old Norse concepts of the Thing, a public assembly for settling disputes, took root alongside the Anglo-Saxon courts. Language itself shifted. Edgar's grandchildren might grow up calling their farmstead a toft, or their enclosure a garth. Towns like Grimsby, Whitby and Derby carry those Norse suffixes to this day. Even common English words, sky, egg, law, owe their place to the Danelaw. But when two legal systems meet on one island, conflict is never far away. So how did this uneasy coexistence shape politics? For Edgar and his kin, living near the frontier was a balancing act. A marriage alliance with a Danish settler might secure land, but loyalty to Mercian lords brought obligations to resist. Archaeology shows us mixed communities. Anglo-Saxon burials alongside Viking grave goods, evidence of interwoven lives. Yet there was also tension. Mercian and Wessex leaders worried about rebellion, while Viking jarls sought to expand beyond their agreed borders. The border wasn't fixed, it shifted with every raid and counter-raid. For Edgar's generation, identity was fluid. Was he Mercian? English? A subject of Guthrum's heirs? That raises the question, if the Danelaw fractured England, how did the kingdom ever reunite? The answer lies in the generations after Alfred. His descendants, especially Edward the Elder and Athelstan, pressed relentlessly against the Danelaw. Fortress building, the Burhs, allowed Saxons to retake territory piece by piece. By the 920s, Edgar's children might have witnessed Mercia reabsorbed into Wessex's growing hegemony. For them, the Viking towns weren't disappearing, they were being folded into an emerging kingdom that dared to call itself England. Athelstan's victory at Brunanburh in 937 marked a symbolic triumph. For the first time, a single king claimed authority from the Channel to the Firth of Forth. But reunification came at a cost. What did England inherit from the Danelaw that couldn't simply be erased? The Danelaw left its imprint in law codes, in place names, in the mingling of peoples. The boundary line faded, but the cultural divide echoed for centuries. Even the north-south tensions in later English politics, some historians argue, have roots in this Viking Age fracture. Our Edgar, had he lived long enough, might have marvelled at how his grandchildren spoke words he barely understood, or how their laws balanced Saxon customs with Norse innovation. The Danelaw was absorbed, but never forgotten. And that invites us to ask, if the Danelaw fractured England but also forced it into unity, what comes next in this fragile island's story? The Danelaw taught England that borders could shift, cultures could collide, and yet something new could emerge from the division. What began as a conquest became coexistence, and from that coexistence rose the first idea of a unified kingdom. But the story doesn't end here. For just as England was stitching itself back together, a new threat loomed from across the sea. Not Vikings this time, but Normans. And their arrival in 1066 wouldn't just divide the land, it would redefine what kingship itself meant. Thank you for walking a little further down the road that made Britain with me. The story winds on. Try this one. I think you'll like it. Until then, thanks so much for watching. Take care, and I'll see you very soon.